The first thing Elias Warren carried toward the ridge was not a rifle, not a lantern, not even a coat heavy enough for the wind already rolling off the northern plains. It was a rolled-up length of oiled canvas tied to the back of a sway-backed mule named Judah, followed by a heavy iron pickaxe worn smooth at the grip. His old blue tick hound, Ridge, moved a few steps ahead through the frozen grass, nose low, breath fogging in short white clouds. The Dakota Territory that winter had already turned quiet in a way that made older ranchers uneasy. Snow had come 3 times before Christmas, and each time it had melted, refroze, and left the ground hard as pig iron beneath a thin dusting of powder. Elias climbed the shallow slope east of Cold Spring Crossing until he reached the plank door leaning crooked against a slab of frost-cracked stone. 2 hours earlier, he had stood inside the freight office beside a broken cast iron heater, while a bankrupt copper prospector named Harlan Boyd slid a folded deed across the counter for $5 in silver coin. That was all the shaft was worth now. $5 and a wet handshake. The laughter had started before Elias even finished counting the coins. Cyrus Halloway, who owned the largest grain warehouse in the county, had leaned against the doorframe with his thumbs hooked into his vest and grinned wide enough for the whole room to see. Only man in the territory who pays cash for a hole in the ground. Elias never argued. He folded the deed once, slid it into the lining of his coat, and asked Harlan Boyd one quiet question. Does the shaft draw dry or does it seep? Cold Spring Crossing had once believed copper would carry it into the new century. Then wheat. Then the branch railroad that never came further west than Yankton. By the time Elias Warren bought the abandoned shaft, the town survived mostly on freight contracts, sod houses banked with dirt against the wind, and a general store run on credit stretched thinner every season. Most of the settlers who arrived that autumn had been told the winters here would be mild. The pamphlets had promised so. The land agents had smiled while promising it. Their soddy sat on the flat ground half a mile south of town, walls thick, roof low, windows sealed with waxed paper against the endless January wind. His wife, Hannah, was skimming cream from a shallow crock beside the stove when Elias laid the folded deed on the plank table between them. She did not look at it at first. She finished skimming, wiped the ladle clean, and then dried her hands on her apron before picking the paper up. She read it once, then again. She looked at the small pouch of coins remaining beside the salt tin. We spent our last dollar on a copper shaft that gave out 10 years ago. Elias pulled off his gloves slowly. Judah stamped once outside the door. Ridge lowered himself beside the stove and let out a long, tired breath. Elias pointed toward the seam along the north wall where a thin ribbon of daylight showed through the sod chink. The house breathes wrong. Hannah followed the direction of his finger without answering. She already knew. The winter before, their first on the plains, she had woken one morning with hoarfrost gathered in the wool of her braid, while the stove was still warm to the touch. Cold air had passed through the walls faster than the fire could push it back. 2 children in the settlement south of them had died that same week, not from hunger, from walls that pretended to hold heat while surrendering at every hour of the night. That evening, long after Hannah had gone to sleep, Elias sat beside the low stove and turned the pickaxe over in his hands. Ridge lifted his head each time the wind changed against the sod outside. Somewhere far to the north, above the Missouri breaks, the sky had already begun to shift. Elias could not have named the pressure change if pressed, but he felt it the same way his father had once felt storms coming off the Alleghenies as a boy, a tightness behind the eyes, a weight against the collarbone. Judah had refused his oats twice that afternoon. Ridge had circled 3 times before lying down. The mountain of air above the plains was moving, and the town below did not yet know it. At first light the following morning, Elias saddled Judah with a heavier pack frame and started up the ridge alone. Ridge trotted beside him, breath steaming through the pale winter sun. The shaft entrance faced south, half hidden beneath a tumble of frost-cracked stone and the skeleton of an old timber headframe that had collapsed sideways during some forgotten thaw. Elias pried the plank door loose with the flat of the pickaxe and stepped into darkness that smelled of wet mineral dust and cold iron. Ridge went ahead without waiting for permission. That told Elias more than any survey map could have. Dogs did not walk willingly into places that killed them. The first drift ran level for about 40 feet before angling gently downward into the ridge. The lantern flame he carried bent softly toward the entrance for the first few paces, then steadied as he moved deeper. Elias stopped and held the lantern still. The flame no longer wavered at all. That meant the shaft did not draw wind through it, only exchanged air slowly through some smaller vent higher along the ridge. He pressed his bare hand against the stone wall. Cold, but not the killing cold of frozen timber. The rock had gathered its temperature from the earth beneath, not from the wind above. That distinction, he already knew, was the difference between shelter and a grave. Farther in, the tunnel widened into a working chamber where the old miners had chased a copper vein that finally pinched out. Timber cribbing still braced the ceiling, blackened with age but sound enough when Elias struck it with the pickaxe handle. A crude fire ring of stacked stones sat near the eastern wall, its edges soot-stained from fires burned by men long dead. Above the ring, a narrow fissure ran upward through the rock, invisible from outside but drawing smoke cleanly toward the surface. A natural flue. Elias raised the lantern toward it and watched the flame lean gently upward. Whoever had worked this shaft before its abandonment had understood exactly what he was standing inside. Ridge had already chosen his corner. The old hound circled twice against the eastern wall, well back from the entrance draft, and folded himself against the stone. Elias watched the dog settle and said nothing for a long moment. Then he began measuring. He paced the chamber corner to corner, counting his boots, marking the walls with charcoal, noting where the ceiling dropped and where it rose. He identified 3 separate weaknesses before he finished. The entrance draft that would need breaking. A slow seep along the western wall where old snow melt had left mineral streaks, and a low spot in the floor that would collect any water running back toward the mouth. None of them were fatal. All of them were fixable. That afternoon, he began hauling. First the canvas, which he tacked in 2 overlapping layers across the entrance with a gap of 6 inches between them to trap wind before it reached the chamber. Then flat stones from the creek bed at the foot of the ridge, each one selected for its ability to hold heat once warmed beside a fire. Judah carried 4 at a time in canvas slings, and by nightfall the mule's flanks trembled with fatigue. Elias unloaded him gently, rubbed him down with dry sacking, and led him back toward the soddy without a word. Hannah met him at the door with a bowl of hot beans and did not ask how the day had gone. She had learned during their first year on the plains that some questions were answered better by the following morning than by any words spoken that night. For 6 days after that, Elias moved between the soddy and the shaft the way a man moves between 2 rooms of the same house. He raised a plank bed framed nearly a foot above the chamber floor so that cold stone could not draw warmth from a sleeping body through the night. He cut a shallow drainage trench along the western wall with the pickaxe until seep water ran cleanly away from where anyone might lie down. He hung strips of smoked venison from wooden pegs driven into the timber cribbing, well back from the fire ring, where the cold, dry air would preserve them longer than any spring house in the county. Sacks of dried beans, cornmeal, and hard biscuit went onto raised planks above the floor. Lamp oil in sealed tin jars sat farther in, safe from freezing. Slowly, without announcement, the shaft became something more than a hole in the ground. By the end of the first week, Hannah began climbing the ridge with him. She said nothing about it the first morning she came, only tied her heaviest shawl beneath her coat and followed Judah's tracks up the slope with a bundle of patched wool blankets across her shoulders. Elias did not comment either. Some decisions in a marriage were made without words, and both of them understood that this was one of them. She stepped into the shaft, looked once at the raised bed, the flat stones stacked beside the fire ring, the drainage trench cut clean along the western wall, and then set her bundle down on the plank shelf without speaking. From that morning forward, she worked beside him. She brought order the way he brought structure. She counted lamp oil jars twice each evening and marked the count in a small ledger she kept tucked inside her Bible. She patched grain sacks that had frayed during the haul up the ridge and hung them along the driest wall where they would not gather moisture. She dipped match heads into melted beeswax, one careful bundle at a time, so that damp air would not ruin them if the winter turned wet. She learned to read the flame of the lantern the way Elias read it, watching the way it leaned when the canvas curtains shifted, learning where the chamber breathed and where it held still. On the 8th day, Elias built his first real fire inside the chamber. He had waited on purpose. He wanted the stones dry, the flue clear, the canvas set properly, and the drainage trench tested against a hard rain before he trusted flame to the space. He laid the fire small at first, using dry pine kindling and a handful of split juniper he had hauled up from the creek bottom. The flame caught quickly. Smoke rose in a thin gray ribbon, drifted toward the natural flue in the ceiling, and disappeared upward without hesitation. Elias watched it for a full minute before adding another piece of wood. Hannah stood beside him with one hand resting on Ridge's back. Then he made his first mistake. He added too much wood too quickly. The flames climbed high enough to reach the lower edge of the flue opening, and something in the pressure balance shifted. Smoke that had been drawing cleanly upward suddenly rolled sideways, spilling in a slow black wave beneath the chamber ceiling. Ridge sprang up barking and shoved himself against Hannah's legs, driving her backward toward the entrance canvas. Hannah coughed hard into the crook of her elbow. Elias killed the fire in seconds, smothering it with a shovel of dry sand he had stacked nearby for exactly this reason. The chamber went dark except for the lantern. His hands were shaking, but not from the smoke. He had learned something that could not be taught by any book. A fire inside stone did not behave like a fire in open air. Heat, pressure, and the shape of the walls all worked together, and if a man built too eagerly, the shelter that was supposed to save him would poison him instead. That night, long after Hannah had gone home to sleep in the soddy with Ridge curled against the door, Elias stayed inside the chamber alone. He lit a single candle beside the fire ring and watched how the flame moved. Tiny flame, tiny movements. He learned the shaft the way a horse learned a new rider, slowly and with patience. By midnight he understood exactly how the chamber wanted to breathe, and exactly how large a fire it would tolerate before turning against him. The following morning, he began the harder work. He rebuilt the fire ring itself, laying it lower and narrower than before, packing the outer edge with the flat creek stones he had hauled up all week. The stones would absorb heat slowly as the fire burned, and then release it steadily long after the flames had died down. He had seen the principle at work once as a boy in Pennsylvania, in the stone floor of a Mennonite bakehouse that stayed warm through the whole night after the ovens had been shut. The chamber would not need a roaring fire. It would need a slow, patient one, feeding stone as much as air. That was the difference between men who survived winter and men who burned through their firewood by February and then froze in March. Every sack of flour, every jar of lamp oil, every coil of manila rope that came up the ridge that autumn was paid for in labor split between two employers, neither of whom paid enough on his own. 6 mornings a week, Elias worked at the freight yard near the rail spur, loading crates of finished lumber onto wagons headed south toward the settlements along the James River. 3 afternoons a week, he split cordwood behind the livery stable for the widow McCready, who paid him in credit at the general store rather than coin. He carried the calluses of both jobs in the same set of hands, and by the middle of November those hands cracked open at the knuckles every night no matter how much lard Hannah rubbed into them by the stove. The buying itself had to be done carefully. A man who walked into the general store and asked for 50 pounds of pinto beans in one purchase drew attention. A man who bought 5 pounds one week and 8 pounds the next passed unnoticed. Elias spread his purchases across 9 different weeks, alternating between the 2 stores in town so neither ledger showed the full picture. Beans one week, cornmeal the next, salt pork the week after that, lamp oil matches, a small sack of dried apples for Hannah's baking, Nothing suspicious in isolation, everything necessary in sum. He carried the goods home in a wooden crate strapped to Judah's back, and every load that reached the soddy that evening went up the ridge to the shaft before sunrise the following morning. By the middle of November, however, one man had begun to notice. Cyrus Halloway did not run the general store, but he owned the grain warehouse that supplied it, and he held the paper on nearly every account book in Cold Spring Crossing. Debt was his real business. Flour, salt pork, and lamp oil were only the visible parts of it. He had watched settlements come and go across the Dakota Territory for 20 years, and he had learned to read a man's intentions by the shape of his purchases the way a doctor read fever by the color of a patient's tongue. Elias Warren was buying like a man who expected the world to close its doors against him. That, in Cyrus Halloway's experience, was either weakness or defiance, and neither one was good for business. He stopped Elias outside the general store one gray afternoon, while thin snow drifted sideways across the boardwalk. Halloway was a large man, broad in the shoulders and heavier through the middle than most men his age, and he wore a good black wool coat that had never seen a full day of outdoor labor. He rested one gloved hand on the door frame beside the ledger nailed to the wall and smiled the way a shopkeeper smiles at a customer he intends to remember. Stocking up for a siege, Warren. Elias tightened the rope across the crate on Judah's back and did not look up, stocking up for weather. Halloway's smile held, but his eyes narrowed slightly at the corners. He tipped his hat, wished Elias a good afternoon, and stepped back inside the store. Elias led Judah down the muddy street without looking back once. He knew perfectly well what had just happened. In a town where nearly every family survived on credit stretched from one harvest to the next, a man who bought outside the credit system, who paid in coin, who accumulated supplies without accumulating debt, was a man who could not be controlled. And men who could not be controlled were, in Cyrus Halloway's private accounting, more dangerous than any storm. That night, long after the warehouse lanterns had gone dark, Elias returned to the shaft to bank the coals for the evening and found something waiting beside the entrance canvas. A small wooden crate, unmarked, containing 4 sealed tin jars of lamp oil, a pound of clean rock salt in brown paper, and a folded square of oilskin large enough to line a bedroll against ground damp. There was no note. The tracks in the thin snow led back down the ridge toward town, small enough to belong to a woman rather than a man, and they disappeared at the edge of the wagon road below. Elias stood beside the crate for a long moment. Then he carried it inside without a word to anyone. 2 mornings after the crate appeared beside the entrance, Elias climbed the ridge in the pale gray light before dawn and found the second one waiting in the same place. This time it held a small crock of rendered goose fat sealed with wax, a bundle of dried sage tied in coarse twine, and a folded scrap of paper containing only 3 words written in a careful woman's hand. Wind is turning. Elias read the paper twice. Then he burned it in the small tin plate he kept beside the fire ring, and he said nothing about the message to Hannah when he returned to the soddy for breakfast. Some kindnesses in a small town survived only as long as no one spoke them aloud. He met Rose Halloway 3 days later at the town well, where she had gone to draw water because the well behind her father's warehouse had frozen solid overnight. She was perhaps 22 years old, plainly dressed in a gray wool coat that had been mended twice at the cuffs, and she carried herself with the quiet economy of a woman who had learned young that her father's household ran on watching and not on speaking. She did not greet Elias when he approached. She simply set her bucket on the well curb, adjusted the rope, and said, without turning her head, "My father keeps his own supplies under the warehouse floor. Enough for the whole town if he chose to share them. He does not choose." Then she drew her water, lifted the bucket, and walked away toward the warehouse without looking back once. Elias watched her go with a slow tightening across the back of his neck. He had suspected Cyrus Halloway's caution ran deeper than ordinary greed, but he had not known until that moment exactly how much lay hidden under the warehouse floorboards. That afternoon, he doubled his own work at the ridge. He hauled 2 extra loads of split juniper before nightfall, laid another tier of flat creek stones around the fire ring, and began cutting a second, smaller supply shelf into the western wall of the chamber. Whatever came that winter, he no longer trusted the assumption that the town's suffering would remain the town's alone. If Holloway meant to hoard, the shaft would need to feed more than 2 people. Elias was not the only one who had begun watching the sky. The widow Adelaide Marsh, who had buried her husband in the 3rd year of their homestead and continued proving up the claim alone with nothing but a milk cow and a stubbornness that had become locally famous, stopped Elias one afternoon outside the general store. She was a small woman, perhaps 60 years of age, with a face weathered into the color of good saddle leather and eyes that missed nothing. She looked once at the sack strapped to Judah's back and once at the northern horizon and then spoke without preamble. "Your shaft," she said. "Does it draw dry or does it seep?" Elias set down the coil of rope in his hand, dry along the sleeping side. "There is a seep on the west wall. I cut a trench for it." She nodded slowly, as though he had answered a question in a language only she and 1 or 2 others in the county still spoke. She told him then about the winter of 1856, when she had been a girl of 7 traveling west with her family along the Platte River Road. A storm had caught their wagon company in the open country south of Fort Kearny, and they had survived 9 days beneath the overturned wagon boxes by banking snow against the wheels and burning buffalo chips in a small pit dug into the frozen earth. Her father had died of pneumonia the following spring, but her mother and her 3 brothers had lived, and she had learned then a truth that most settlers on the plains never bothered to learn until it was too late. "Wind," she said, "kills more people than cold ever will. A man who understands wind can live in a snowbank. A man who does not can freeze inside his own kitchen." Before she left, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pressed a small paper twist of mustard seed into Hannah's hand, then a folded square of dried peppermint for tea. She said nothing else. She simply turned and walked away toward her homestead, small against the enormous gray sky. 2 mornings after Adelaide Marsh walked away from the general store, Elias stepped out of the soddy at dawn and found fresh boot prints in the thin crust of overnight snow, leading from the wagon road up the slope toward the shaft. Beside the entrance sat a neat stack of dried cottonwood, split fine for kindling, and an old brass compass tied to the top of the pile with a length of rawhide. Ridge sniffed at the tracks once, wagged his tail, and started up the ridge without waiting. Elias followed him. Halfway to the shaft, he met the man himself coming back down, a rifle over one shoulder and a flour sack over the other. Silas Coburn was a former mining hand who had once worked the copper vein in that same shaft 20 years earlier, back when Cold Spring Crossing had still believed in its own future. He lived alone now in a sod dugout beyond the eastern ridge, and most people in town assumed he was either half mad or completely so, though the truth was closer to neither. He had simply stopped needing what other people needed. He nodded to Elias when they met on the slope, adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder, and asked if he might see the chamber. Elias led him back up the ridge without a word. Silas stepped inside the shaft the way a man steps inside the church of his childhood after a long absence. He rested one gnarled hand against the timber cribbing near the entrance and stood still for a long moment, breathing in the cold mineral air. Then he walked to the eastern wall and pointed at something Elias had never noticed before. A series of faint marks scratched into the stone above head height. Small vertical lines, grouped in fives, the way a man counts days. Elias raised the lantern and counted them silently. There were more than 100. Silas set the flour sack down beside the fire ring and rested his palm flat against the rock, the way another man might rest his hand on a headstone. "Winter of '68, he said quietly. "I spent 11 weeks in this chamber when the copper played out and the company left without paying the last of the crew. 3 of us came in through that door. 2 of us walked out." Elias did not ask what had happened to the 3rd. Silas Coburn's face already carried the answer. The old man moved slowly around the chamber after that, testing the timber cribbing with the flat of his hand, examining the flue, running his fingers along the drainage trench Elias had cut. He nodded approvingly at the raised bed frame. He nodded again at the flat stones stacked around the fire ring. Then he turned and looked directly at Elias for the first time. "The stone will keep you warm," he said. "That much I already know. But the stone will also keep your loneliness. A man alone in this chamber will hear things after the first month that were not there before. He will begin to argue with people who are not present. He will wake in the night convinced someone is sitting beside him. The chamber holds heat, but it also holds whatever a man brings into it. If you bring fear, the fear will grow. If you bring anger, the anger will grow. Bring only what you can afford to have doubled." Elias stood silent for a long moment. Outside the entrance, the wind had begun to shift again, coming now from the northwest instead of the north. Ridge lifted his head toward the sound. Silas noticed the dog's movement and smiled faintly. The old miner opened the flour sack he had carried in with him and began removing its contents onto the plank shelf. A tin of hardtack, a bundle of tallow candles, a small oilcloth-wrapped packet of tea leaves, a leather sheath containing a bone-handled knife with an edge honed to a mirror. He set each item down carefully, without comment, and then straightened and turned back toward the entrance. He paused at the canvas curtain and looked back once. "If it gets bad," he said, "you will not have to come find me. I will already know." Then he stepped through the canvas and disappeared down the ridge into the pale winter light, leaving Elias standing alone in the chamber with the count of 11 weeks staring down from the wall above him. The last week of December brought a kind of quiet across the Dakota Territory that older settlers had learned to distrust. The wind, which had blown steadily out of the northwest for most of the autumn, dropped to almost nothing by the third day after Christmas. The temperature climbed unexpectedly, first into the 20s, then into the 30s, then into the low 40s by New Year's Day. Snow that had crusted hard across the prairie began to soften. Water ran in thin, bright ribbons along the ruts of the wagon road. Children ran outside without coats. Farmers unbuttoned their heavy jackets while pitching hay to their cattle. In the town of Cold Spring Crossing, men stood on the boardwalk in their shirt sleeves and joked about mild winters and the exaggerations of old-timers. Elias did not join them. He watched the sky instead. He watched the way the geese overhead flew lower than they had the week before, and the way Judah refused his oats 2 mornings in a row, and the way Ridge circled 3 times before lying down each evening, and then rose again an hour later to circle 3 times more. He watched the barometer he had traded a full day of freight labor for at the general store, and he saw the needle drop steadily throughout the first week of January, even as the air outside grew warmer. He hauled 2 more loads of split juniper up the ridge that week. He hauled another sack of pinto beans. He carried Hannah's extra wool blankets up to the chamber and hung them along the driest wall. Adelaide Marsh stopped him outside her homestead one afternoon as he passed on the road. She was standing beside her cow with a bucket in one hand and a look on her face that Elias had already learned to read. She did not greet him. She simply said 3 days. Then she carried her bucket into the barn and closed the door behind her. The morning of January 12, 1888, dawned gray and unusually warm. A soft southerly breeze moved across the prairie. The temperature stood near 40 degrees by 10 o'clock. Children in Cold Spring Crossing walked to the schoolhouse without their heavy coats. Farmers rode out to check on cattle wearing only wool vests over their shirts. The sky to the northwest was clear and pale. There was no visible warning. There was nothing on the horizon at all until, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something began to appear along the northwestern skyline that no one in the town had ever seen before. It came as a solid gray wall, not clouds, not a bank of snow. A wall, moving fast enough that a rider on horseback could not have outrun it, rising perhaps 2,000 feet from the ground and stretching from horizon to horizon in either direction. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 10 minutes. The southerly breeze died completely, replaced within seconds by a howling northwest wind that arrived with the force of a locomotive. Snow began to fall so thickly and so hard that a man standing on the boardwalk in Cold Spring Crossing could not see the building across the street. Within 20 minutes, he could not see his own hand held at arm's length in front of his face. Elias was already on the ridge when it hit. He had climbed up at noon to check the chamber and had lingered longer than he intended, watching the barometer he had carried up in his coat pocket. When the wall appeared to the northwest, he did not run for the soddy. He knew he would never reach it in time. He tightened the canvas curtains across the entrance, banked the fire with a fresh load of juniper, and stood inside the chamber listening as the storm struck the ridge above him with a sound like an avalanche of iron. Ridge pressed himself against the eastern wall and did not move. Judah, whom Elias had tied inside the small windbreak he had built beside the entrance, screamed once in the darkness and then went silent. Hannah was in the soddy. She had gone into town that morning to trade eggs at the general store, and she had been walking home along the wagon road when the wall came down out of the sky. Elias did not know this yet. He would not know it for another 2 hours. He only knew that the storm had arrived exactly when Adelaide Marsh had said it would, and that everyone he loved was now somewhere on the other side of a wind that could kill a grown man in 15 minutes. Elias waited inside the chamber for perhaps a quarter of an hour before he understood that waiting was itself a decision he could not afford to make. The wind above the ridge had reached a pitch he had never heard from any storm in his life, a sustained low howl underscored by sudden hammering gusts that shook loose fragments of frost from the timber cribbing near the entrance. But inside the chamber the fire held. The stones held. The canvas curtains snapped against their timber poles without letting the killing air behind them. That was what decided him. If the chamber could hold against this, then it could hold against him leaving it briefly, and there was a woman on the wagon road who needed him more than the shelter did. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a length of manila rope twice around his waist, and knotted it to the iron ring he had driven into the stone beside the entrance for exactly this purpose. He paid the rope out behind him as he stepped through the canvas curtain into the storm. The wind struck him with a force that nearly knocked him from his feet. Ridge came with him, pressed hard against his leg, and Elias did not try to send the dog back. Some help could not be refused. He moved down the ridge one step at a time, feeling ahead with his boots for the trail he had walked 100 times that autumn and could no longer see through the sideways snow. The rope ran out 50 yards from the entrance. He tied a second length to the end of it and continued down the slope. He found Hannah at the base of the ridge, perhaps 120 yards from the shaft, kneeling in the snow with one arm around a small figure bundled in a wool coat too large for her body. Elias recognized the child a moment before Hannah spoke. It was Mercy Coburn, Silas's granddaughter, 7 years old, who had been walking home from the schoolhouse when the wall came down out of the sky. Hannah had found her wandering blind along the wagon road and had turned back toward the ridge because she knew the soddy was too far and the shaft was closer. He got them both to the entrance in perhaps 20 minutes, though he could not have said afterward how long it actually took. Inside the chamber, Hannah collapsed against the plank bed and did not speak for nearly a quarter of an hour. Mercy's fingers had gone white to the second knuckle. Elias warmed them slowly against his own bare stomach beneath his shirt, the way his father had once taught him to warm frostbitten hands as a boy in Pennsylvania. Ridge lay down across the child's feet and did not move. The fire held steady. The stone bench beside it carried enough warmth that Hannah, when she finally spoke, whispered only 3 words. "It works, Elias." He did not answer. He was already pulling his coat back on. He made 4 more trips down the ridge before nightfall. On the second trip, he found Silas Coburn himself, half frozen inside the small windbreak of the old headframe 50 yards below the entrance. The old miner had heard the storm coming an hour before it struck, and he had walked 6 miles across the open prairie in the softening January air to reach the shaft before the wall came down. He had arrived at the base of the ridge perhaps 4 minutes too late. Elias got him inside, wrapped him in 3 of Hannah's wool blankets, and set him beside the stone bench with a cup of hot water and a piece of hardtack he could not yet chew. On the third trip, he found Adelaide Marsh clinging to the last fence post at the edge of her homestead pasture. She had left her sod house when the wall struck, and had walked half a mile toward the ridge with nothing but her instinct and her memory of the winter of 1856 to guide her. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds, and Elias carried her the last quarter mile against his chest with the rope paid out behind him. On the fourth trip, he found Rose Halloway. She was alone on the wagon road, walking east away from the warehouse, with a small canvas bundle strapped across her back and no coat heavier than the gray wool she had worn to the well the week before. By full dark on the first night of the storm, the chamber held 9 people: Elias and Hannah, Mercy Coburn and her grandfather Silas, Adelaide Marsh, wrapped in 3 blankets beside the stone bench with color slowly returning to her face, Rose Halloway, silent along the western wall with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water she had not yet drunk, and 3 men Elias had found together on his 5th trip down the ridge, a freight hauler named Josiah Bell, and 2 of his teamsters who had abandoned their wagon a quarter mile east when the lead horse went down in a drift and could not be pulled up again. They had followed the sound of Ridge's barking through the storm and would not have found the entrance without it. Elias made 2 more trips before Hannah refused to let him go again. On the 6th trip, he brought in a young mother named Lydia Ashcraft and her 2 small sons, whom he found sheltering behind the collapsed frame of a chicken coop 300 yards north of the wagon road. On the 7th trip, he brought in the school teacher, a man named Nathaniel Prine, who had left the schoolhouse in an effort to walk the last 2 children home to their families and had reached neither destination. Prine had lost his hat and one glove in the storm, and the fingers of his right hand had gone the color of old candle wax by the time Elias got him inside. That made 14 people in the chamber, counting the children. Elias tried to go out an 8th time. Hannah stepped in front of the canvas curtain and put both hands flat against his chest and did not move. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, "If you go out again, you will not come back, and there are 14 people in this room who will die without you." Elias stood in front of her for a long moment. Then he set the rope down beside the entrance and turned back toward the fire. The storm held for 3 full days. The wind never dropped below a sustained howl during that entire time. On the 2nd morning, Elias eased back the canvas curtain far enough to look out and saw that the entire ridge below the entrance had disappeared under a single unbroken sheet of white so hard-packed by wind that it could have supported the weight of a horse. The temperature outside, measured against the small mercury thermometer Adelaide Marsh had carried in the pocket of her coat, stood at 40 degrees below zero. Inside the chamber, the stone bench beside the fire held steady at a temperature Adelaide judged to be near 60. She had lived through enough winters to know the difference by touch alone. The systems Elias had built began to prove themselves one by one. The raised bed frame kept sleeping bodies clear of the cold stone floor. The drainage trench along the western wall carried away the water that dripped steadily from the ceiling as the fire warmed the upper chamber and released moisture from the rock. The double canvas curtains held against every gust that struck the ridge, and the small gap between them broke the wind before it reached the chamber. The natural flue drew smoke cleanly upward without a single reversal. The Flat Creek stone stacked around the fire ring absorbed heat during the burning hours and released it slowly through the night, so that the chamber never went cold even when the fire was allowed to sink low to conserve wood. Hannah managed the food. She measured portions with a small tin cup and served herself last at every meal. She did not tell anyone she was doing this, and only Adelaide Marsh noticed. On the 2nd evening, Adelaide silently traded her own portion with Hannah's when Hannah's back was turned, and the 2 women looked at each other across the fire afterward and said nothing at all. Silas Coburn told stories at night, quietly, to Mercy and to the Ashcraft boys, stories he had heard as a young man in the copper camps of the upper Midwest. His voice held the chamber together in a way that no fire could have done alone. On the 3rd night, Nathaniel Prine woke everyone with a low sound Elias had not heard from a grown man in many years. He was crying into his one good hand because he had realized, sometime during the sleeping hours, that he was almost certainly still alive. The storm broke on the morning of January 15th. It did not end all at once. The wind weakened first, then the sky lightened from gray to pale silver, and finally, near noon, the snow stopped falling altogether. Elias eased the canvas curtain aside and looked out onto a world that had been erased and rewritten in 3 days. The wagon road was gone. The fence lines were gone. The shape of the land itself had been smoothed into long white waves that ran from the northwest to the southeast in unbroken curves. In the distance, where the town of Cold Spring Crossing should have stood, only the tops of 3 chimneys and 1 steeple remained visible above the drifts. The 14 people inside the chamber walked out one at a time, blinking in the light, and stood together on the ridge without speaking. The sun on the snow was bright enough to hurt. Ridge came out last and stood beside Elias with his tail moving slowly against the back of his leg. Judah, whom Elias had feared lost, called once from inside the windbreak beside the entrance, and was answered by his master with a hand laid against his flank and no words at all. The town below had not fared as well. 19 people had died in Cold Spring Crossing during the 3 days of the storm, most of them frozen inside their own houses when their chimneys iced shut or their walls surrendered heat faster than their stoves could replace it. 2 children from the schoolhouse had never made it home and were found the following week in a snowdrift a quarter-mile from their front door. A freight hauler was discovered still seated on his wagon box, reins in his hands, 3 miles east of town. The storm would come to be remembered across the northern plains as the schoolchildren's blizzard, and it would kill more than 200 people across 4 states and territories before its full accounting was finished. Cyrus Halloway's warehouse still stood. He had reinforced it from the inside before the storm, packing clay into the outer seams, banking snow against the walls in careful channels to break the wind. Beneath the floorboards lay flour, salt pork, beans, and lamp, oil enough to have fed the town for a month. Rose did not return to her father's house. She stayed instead with Adelaide Marsh at the homestead east of the ridge, and she carried her own bundle down the ridge on the morning the roads reopened, and did not look back once. Cyrus Halloway lived another 11 years in Cold Spring Crossing, but he never again held the paper on more than a handful of accounts. The town had learned something about him that could not be unlearned. Elias Warren became, without ever intending it, the man that families sent for when they wanted to know how a house should breathe. He moved from cabin to cabin through the spring and summer that followed, showing settlers how to bank earth against outer walls, how to raise beds off cold floors, how to hang canvas behind front doors to break the wind before it reached the chamber, how to build a fire that fed stone as much as air. He never charged for the work. Hannah packed him a lunch each morning, and he came home each evening tired in a way that no freight yard had ever made him tired, and it was a good tiredness, the kind a man carries with him into sleep without regret. The shaft itself acquired a name that no one remembered choosing: Warren's Hollow. Supplies were stored there year-round after that winter. Extra beans, lamp oil, split juniper canvas, matches sealed in beeswax. Every autumn, the families of the valley walked their contributions up the ridge without discussion, and every spring what remained was inventoried and rotated and stored again. The chamber never held 14 people again, but it stood ready to, and everyone in the county knew it. Elias returned to the deepest part of the chamber one quiet evening the following spring, carrying a lantern he no longer needed. The old count of 11 weeks that Sela's Coburn had scratched into the stone was still there, dark against the pale rock. Elias took out his knife and cut one new mark beside it. Only one. Then he stood in the silence for a long moment, listening to the mountain breathe. Outside, Hannah was calling him home for supper.